situation was exactly what Alexander and Samantha had expected, but they were still suspicious about the timing of it all. "What evidence?" Samantha demanded. "And where did it come from?" The security guard hesitated for a moment, wary of angering Samantha and Alexander. Then he pulled himself together and answered, "It's all over the internet." The story had already gone viral, and everyone was talking about it. A few irrational people even believed that Alexander had forcefully extracted Susie's bone marrow by himself. There was also a photograph of someone carrying Susie into the hospital, and it looked like she was being taken there against her will. A short time after the photo had appeared, someone had looked up the hospital's surgery schedule and found Thomas's bone marrow transplant listed on it. It was obvious that Susie's bone marrow was being used to save Thomas, and everyone knew that Samantha and Alexander must have forced her to do so. After all, everyone knew how much Samantha cared about Thomas, and it was clear she would do anything for him. A few people gossiped about Susie and Thomas being biological siblings, but most people didn't care. Others insisted that biological siblings were under no obligation to donate their bone marrow to each other, and that everyone should have the right to refuse such a procedure. People who gossiped on the internet tended to be fickle. Not so long ago, they had scolded Susie for not saving her brother's life. They had been even more outraged that she had used her bone marrow as a bargaining chip to restore her reputation. But with the latest news, they had forgotten all of that. Many of them had the attention spans of small children, and they were completely unashamed to argue the opposite of their previous stance. They just wanted to claim the moral high ground and verbally attack those that they wouldn't dream of confronting in real life. Alexander nodded to Jack. "Go and investigate this matter." He had a good idea of who was behind the story. It had to be someone who wanted Blue Whale Enterprises to collapse. For years, they had waited for an opportunity to annex the market they had been unable to reach. But Alexander needed to find out the extent of each family's involvement and what their intentions were. After all, he never wasted time on exacting revenge for trivial matters, as he had neither the time nor the patience to do so. But they had made the mistake of involving Samantha, so there was no way he could sit back and do nothing. "I need to go out for a while." Samantha put on her coat. Frowning, Alexander grabbed her wrist. "Why? Ignore the journalists outside. It's better not to engage with them." Samantha sighed. "I don't want to argue with them, but they're right outside the hospital, so this isn't just a private matter anymore. Clearly, these reporters have no sense of professional ethics, and they have the hospital surrounded. They're being disruptive, and if we don't show ourselves, they'll stay right where they are. We can't let that happen. As a good citizen, don't you want to help the hospital by getting rid of the reporters?" "Who said I wanted to be a good citizen?" Alexander had never cared about such things, but he still followed Samantha outside. As soon as they stepped out of the elevator, they were overcome by a cacophony of noise and the constant flashing of cameras. Alexander wrapped his arm around Samantha and pulled her closer, turning sideways to block her from the blinding light. His icy gaze swept over the crowd, and one reporter became so frightened that he visibly trembled. But when he remembered what a big story it was, he summoned his courage. The flashes eased off a little, but the reporters began to call out to Alexander. "Mr. Brown, do you have any comment regarding the matter of you forcing Susie Adams to donate her bone marrow? Is the story true, Mr. Brown? Can you tell us about Susie's current condition? Alexander, have you always been so cruel to your ex-girlfriends?" A moment later, the reporters turned to Samantha, firing questions at her instead. "Mrs. Brown, what role did you play in this crime? Samantha, you have a reputation for being kind. Do you think your image can survive this scandal? Are you deliberately taking revenge on Susie?" As he listened, Alexander's expression grew increasingly fierce, and he had to fight the urge to respond with profanities. Dozens of reporters filled the lobby, and they were crammed in so tightly that they blocked the entrance. Some patients were trying to walk around to get some exercise, and visitors were there to see their loved ones, but they all found their movements restricted. Even the doctors and nurses found it hard to get where they were going, and that put patients at risk. "Jack," Samantha called. Jack gestured, and 8 bodyguards came out of nowhere to protect Alexander and Samantha. Let's go. Samantha held Alexander's hand as they walked forward. A few bodyguards started to clear a path for them. They knew it was unrealistic to expect the reporters to leave the building. After all, if they cared about the hospital's ability to run smoothly, they wouldn't have been blocking the lobby. As expected, the moment Samantha and Alexander left, the reporters rushed after them, clearing the hospital. The doctors, nurses, patients, and visitors all heaved a sigh of relief. As the reporters hurried after Alexander and Samantha, they continued to call out, "Wait! Alexander, you may be powerful, but you can't toy with other people's lives like this. Samantha, aren't you ashamed of yourself?" The reporters began to get aggressive, and they pushed and shoved at each other, trying to get a better view. Samantha realized they wouldn't stop until she spoke to them. Then, suddenly, a woman's anxious voice rang out from the crowd. "Bobby, where are you? Come to Mommy!" Out of the corner of her eye, Samantha spotted a 3-year-old boy with his forehead wrapped in gauze. He held a lollipop as he looked around in a daze, confused by all the people swarming around. He was so small that many people failed to notice him, and at one point, someone tripped him, sending him sprawling. In the crush, he was likely to be trampled, and no one seemed to be paying attention. "Be careful!" Samantha yelled. Then she launched into action, sprinting forward and throwing herself over him, being careful to protect his head. A moment later, she felt someone pile on top of her, pressing her into the ground. The air whooshed out of her lungs, and she could feel the heat of someone at her back as they tried to protect her. Immediately, she realized it was Alexander. "Sir!" someone called. Then a man's voice shouted, "Get out of the way! Everyone, get back!" Samantha felt Alexander's body stiffen, and she could hear people's footsteps as they cautiously moved away. The reporters began to mutter in panic. "Oh my God, I almost fell over them. I think I accidentally kicked Mr. Brown. What should I do?" Before long, the bodyguards surrounded Samantha and Alexander, keeping them out of danger. "Samantha." Alexander sounded tense. "I'm fine," Samantha assured him. She realized he had called her full name, betraying how afraid he had been for her. Alexander heaved a sigh of relief. Then he got back to his feet and pulled her up, sweeping his gaze over her to check for injuries. His eyes locked on the back of her hand, frowning at the scratch he saw there. But although she had been hurt, she had never stopped trying to protect the little boy in her arms. Alexander glanced at the little boy and frowned. "Alex, are you hurt?" Samantha asked nervously. Alexander's frown deepened into a scowl. "No." A moment later, a woman rushed out of the crowd. "Bobby!" Her voice trembled. "Are you okay?" Before she could reach her son, the bodyguards stepped into her path, blocking her. The little boy was frightened, and when he saw his mother, he started crying. Samantha let go of him, and he ran straight to his mother and threw himself into her arms, sobbing bitterly. His little arms hugged her neck as if he would never let go. "Thank you." The woman blinked at Samantha, tears shining in her eyes. "I don't know how I can ever repay you." Her son had suffered a minor head injury, but he had begun to feel better, and he had been complaining about being stuck in the hospital. She had brought him outside to cheer him up, but she hadn't expected to get swept up in such a large crowd. "I only did what anyone else would do." Samantha felt a little uncomfortable with the woman's gratitude. "Let's forget about it. The important thing is that he's okay." The woman could tell that Samantha and Alexander didn't want to talk, so she thanked them once more, and then she walked away, still carrying her son. Samantha smiled as she watched them go. But as the reporters watched, her expression changed. Previously, she had always appeared gentle, intelligent, and kind in front of the media. When they had confronted her inside the hospital, she had frowned and looked upset. But as they continued to look at her, they realized her expression had turned hostile, and they began to feel uneasy. Before they could react, Samantha grabbed one of the reporters and threw him to the ground, breaking his camera. The reporters looked at each other, stunned into silence by what they had witnessed. If Alexander had attacked them, they would have kept taking pictures. After all, he was infamous for his appalling temper, and rumor had it that he had beaten people badly enough to put them in the ICU. But none of them had expected such behavior from Samantha. She had always been incredibly kind, so her aggression was completely out of character. "Do any of you have something to say?" Samantha looked around at them, one eyebrow raised. "Well, are we done here?" The reporters gaped in shock, and those with cameras had their fingers frozen over the button, not daring to snap a photograph of her. "Samantha, are you angry because you're embarrassed?" One reporter was hidden deep in the crowd, so he felt secure enough to speak. "I'm embarrassed to meet people with no professional ethics." Samantha stared at them all, one by one, and they shivered under her sharp gaze. "Don't you care that you disrupted an entire hospital?" She folded her arms. "Don't you understand how dangerous that was? Even if you lack professionalism, you should still have some common sense. How can you possibly think it's okay to lay siege to a hospital full of sick people? If you delayed a patient's treatment, the outcome could be tragic. And who do you think would be responsible for what happened then?" She looked around, but no one answered. "You." Her voice was firm. "You would be responsible." Then she stared right at the reporter who had asked if she was angry because of embarrassment. "Yes, I am embarrassed. I'm embarrassed by your attitude, and I'm also angry at your behavior. Any decent person would be." The reporter didn't dare speak. "And did you see that poor little boy?" Samantha continued. "That small child with his head all bandaged? He hadn't even healed from those injuries, and you almost hurt him even further. If he had come to harm, could you have lived with yourselves? A person's well-being is much more than chasing a big story to make money. Don't you understand that? Are you really blind to what really matters? As reporters, it's your job to convey the truth, not to deliberately shape public opinion." One reporter frowned. "That sounds like a personal attack on us." "Yes, it is." She raised an eyebrow, silently pointing out that they had done the same thing to her earlier. As far as she was concerned, she was just playing by their rules. The reporters kept watching her, still too shocked to react. Each of them worried that if they annoyed her, she might turn her anger on them. Their equipment was expensive, and they didn't want to risk her destroying it like she had done with their colleague's camera. But they knew they had a job to do, so they needed to keep asking questions. One reporter cleared his throat. "Can you explain why Susie was forced to donate her bone marrow?" "No." Samantha's tone was firm. "As reporters, isn't it your duty to investigate the truth? If you can't do that, then perhaps you should stand aside and make way for someone who can. If we've committed a crime, then the police will deal with it. But if you're intentionally spreading rumors for someone, then nothing we say will make a difference. You'll distort everything we say anyway, so why should we speak to you?" It was clear that she didn't want to talk to them, but she still had managed to remind them that they might not be printing the truth. "Does Mr. Brown feel the same way?" the reporter asked. Alexander had been focusing on protecting Samantha, and he had no interest in dealing with the reporters. But when he heard his name, he looked up, his gaze zeroing in on the reporter who had spoken. His expression seemed to say the man would regret asking him questions. The reporter swallowed hard, and he did, in fact, regret drawing Alexander's attention. "You should know better than to peddle lies." Alexander looked directly at some of the reporters. "Who paid you to act this way?" Many of the reporters had no idea what he was talking about, but the ones Alexander had stared at looked guilty. Many businesses were in competition with Alexander's company, and he suspected that some of his competitors had used the opportunity to arrange for some reporters to ambush him and Samantha. He wondered if the Addams family was involved with the situation as well. The other reporters frowned when they realized a few of the others had ulterior motives for their presence. Instead of reporting on the news, they were acting under instructions from a third party. Most had arrived with an objective attitude, but they had been influenced by the others, allowing themselves to get swept up in the chaos. Gradually, their behavior became more and more extreme, and they had eagerly attacked Samantha and Alexander. But with Alexander's statement, they finally understood that they were being used, and they turned to glare at the people responsible. "You can't threaten us," one of the reporters exclaimed. He wasn't foolish enough to admit he was acting on orders, so he chose to hide behind bluster and mock outrage. Alexander's lips curled into a menacing smile. In his opinion, threatening people was a waste of time, so he never bothered to do so. Instead, he preferred to act without warning his prey first. Later that night, the few media companies that Alexander had singled out all closed down. When they declared bankruptcy, the companies claimed they had been treated unjustly, and they complained that Alexander's words and actions were overbearing. But no one listened. After all, everyone already knew Alexander was exceptionally arrogant, and they had long accepted that fact. After getting rid of the reporters, Samantha went back to the hospital to wait, taking the opportunity to call Stephen and tell him what had happened. As usual, Stephen responded by saying, "I'll settle the matter." Samantha frowned. "How? If Alexander and I don't admit it, someone will eventually suspect you. I'm very grateful for what you've done for Thomas, but I don't want you to get dragged into this." "Would you prefer Alexander took the blame?" Stephen asked, his tone sharp. "I did it, not him. So do you really think I'll let everyone hold him responsible?" Samantha had been worried about him getting into trouble, but she had known he would respond that way. "That's not what I meant," she protested. "It's just that you've already helped me so much." She paused, and then when she spoke again, her voice was soft. "You know I can't compensate you." She knew what he wanted, but she couldn't give him that. "I don't want any compensation," Stephen sighed. "You do realize that if I hadn't grabbed Susie, then Alexander would have done it anyway?" Samantha frowned.